Hello, and welcome once again to another heretical dark episode of Inside the World of MACK'S Headroom.
Hello there, bitch. I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you. You are obviously here against your will. You're going to be kept chained in a variety of different positions, usually with your legs or knees forced wide apart. You'll be raped thoroughly and repeatedly in every hole you've got. You're going to be drugged up real heavy with a combination of sodium pentothal and phenobarbital. You're not going to remember a thing about this little adventure or what has happened to you.
Yes, those were the infamous words of David Parker Ray. Probably, in my humble opinion, and also as a big fan of true crime and having worked in forensic social work for like 30 years, I think is one of the most crazy, disturbed fucks I've ever experienced. I was going to say met in my life, but thank God I didn't meet him. But so I want to talk about him today, but I want to do it a little differently. That's my shtick. When I say heretical, in my little intro, I mean, I really truly mean that. I don't like to give just content that other people have done unless I have a little different spin to add to it. So I want to try to take this little different spin, sort of, to look at this David Parker Ray narrative moron. And that angle is that I want to try to expound upon a little bit of what I've learned from Shawn Attwood, who's just an incredibly industrious, great journalist, I think you have to call him at this point. But he has written many books, and one of his big things is how the plea bargaining system in America works, because he got royally screwed because of what the notion of plea bargaining actually is. And in this particular case of David Parker Ray, it really shows how plea bargaining can go so fucking haywire and backwards that it's unbelievable. And I thought, in the spirit of Shawn's work, I would try to use this case as an example of how fucking insane plea bargaining is. It's just an absolute insane way of trying to run a jurisprudence system. So, I'm going to really try my best to try to stay away from clinical words except one, and that's sexual psychopath, which I believe David Parker Ray absolutely was. But I want to otherwise try to stay away from those kind of words. As you probably know, I have issues with using those in like a public forum. But anyway, yeah, David Parker Ray is a massive sexual psychopath. And some of the things that I want to, other than that, as far as clinical language goes, I want to just try to talk about him a little bit, and I want to lay out the cast of characters, but I don't even really know their names because it's really not important. What's important is to understand the process of how this whole David Parker Ray toy box murder thing operated. And if I could just explain that, I don't think I have to go through all the facts, because you could watch those on other videos. You know what I mean? Why recreate the wheel? But I want to keep this overlay of plea bargaining as like an umbrella or an overdrop to try to discuss this. Okay, so here we go. First of all, what David Parker Ray was famous for was this, how would you describe it? like a small trailer that he had converted into an absolute sexual torture den. And I'm saying specifically sexual torture den. You can see pictures of it on other people's videos. Maybe I'll post a link if anybody's interested to see where you can see the inside of this thing. But it was absolutely fucking nuts. I mean, he had a gynecological table. He had all kinds of spreaders. He was also supposed to be a very good welder and very industrious, and so he built all these crazy things. One which I'm going to try to describe. I don't even know what words to use, but I'm going to try, okay? It was about a pseudo penis, about yay big, okay? And at the bottom of it, it had like pieces of nails that went like this way, and then like a lotus flower, and then another one like that were nails. And he actually painted the tips of each one red. He was so obsessed with sexual sadism. I mean, he had everything. He had an electric generator to give people women electric shocks. I'm just trying to think of the highlights. He video recorded everything. So this whole notion of like there's no such thing as a snuff flick is totally dispelled by the David Parker Ray narrative, because he had, like, I think they found, like, when they busted him, about 100 recordings of like 3-day long, sometimes longer, abductions, and then sometimes he put him in his house for like a day. And I should mention this. That little bit I played at the beginning, he had a 50-minute audio tape that he would, like, after he would kidnap somebody, he'd chain him to a bed, turn all the lights off, blindfold them, inject them with all kinds of drugs, especially sodium amytal and phenobarbital, I think it was, his two favorites, actually. Some people said psychedelic drugs. No, that isn't the case. He says it right on the tape. I just didn't play enough of it. But he used to actually put someone in a bed, turn all the lights off, abandon them, and then play this tape for 50 minutes. This thing went on for 50 minutes about what he's going to do to them. That I just played a little piece of it. But he also, so he definitely was a snuff maker. He allegedly, I don't think it's so alleged. Well, yeah, I guess it is alleged. But he was selling these tapes for large amounts of money after he made them. The whole way they caught the guy was they looked at one tape. I should speak looking at the way I'm tattooed, But they took one tape that caught a little picture of a tattoo of a woman. They played it on the media somewhere. A woman saw it, and she couldn't remember like 3 or 4 days of her life, and went to the police. And I think that's how they ended up actually catching him. But like, I think he committed more than like 30 murders, but it's possible he's done hundreds. So we're talking about a guy that's like actually beyond the scope of, Ted Bundy in many ways. I mean, this guy would just kidnap. First, he'd drug. Well, wait, I got to get into that a little bit more because he had different methods of doing it. But basically, he would abduct somebody, use drugs, or beat them up, store them in his house for a day, play that tape, just make them sit there doing nothing, then put them in this thing called the toy box, which is a separate trailer. By the way, this is in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, which is a very interesting place. I've been through it many times. But he'd put him in this toy box, and then he would torture him for like 3-4 days when he got tired of him. And then sometimes he would let him go. Sometimes they were murdered. That nobody has any idea where the bodies are for various reasons that you can see on other tapes. But he was a monster. I mean, I hate to make comparisons like this, but at least Ted Bundy would go in and just knock somebody out and have necrophilia. I mean, at least that person's life was hopefully short after the attack. This guy would just abduct somebody and just totally mentally and physically and sexually torture them, for like 3-4 days at a time. With all these sexual devices that he made, okay? And again, I got to mention, when they busted him, they found syringes, they found sodium amytal, they found phenobarbital, they found, all this stuff that's just known to put somebody in a delirium. I mean, I think those drugs are called, what are they called? GHB falls into the same category. Deliriants, maybe they're called, or something. Yeah, deliriants, that's it. So the person didn't know what the fuck was going on. Attaching big, regular size clamps like you charge your car with on their nipples and then hooking it up to a generator. I mean, it was absolutely insanity, okay? Hope I've given you a picture of at least the type of moronic, abysmal shit that this guy was into, okay? And he involved, this is where it gets into being like, I think, worse than Charles Manson, okay? Because he involved 3 other co-creators, I suppose you could say. One was his daughter, whose name is Jessie Ray, okay? And she began to realize that her father was deviant at around the age of 19 and did what I guess you would call identify with the aggressor, or if you talk about like Stockholm syndrome, that sort of thing. I mean, she just became just like him, and then he began to use her as like his partner in these horrible sexual wrongdoings. Also, she became like a lure for him. She'd go into bars, slip drugs into people. They'd feel like they were loopy. They'd say, "Hey, I'll take you back to my dad's house. Don't worry." And then bango, they're in the toy box. Okay, so that's Jessie Ray, who identified with the aggressor. Okay, and then there's like 2 others. One by the name of Kelly Van Cleve, who I think, if I'm not mistaken, took the biggest dive, unfortunately, because I think that she was actually a victim originally, who was a friend of Jessie Ray's. And yes, Jessie Ray slipped her drugs, took her to the toy box, and David returned her home. And then she came back to him, I guess. I don't know, but it's insanity, okay? It's just absolute insanity. I think that was because her family rejected her. And there's also a guy involved, too, who actually was told by David Parker Ray to strangle after he was observing one of his sessions, which, I have to mention, were all videotaped and were allegedly sold as snuff flicks, okay? And apparently, like, the bodies were buried in very special places. He had all kinds of knowledge of a lake that was near Truth or Consequences, and he knew just how to bury things the right way. And so, okay. So anyway, you have to understand that what David Parker Ray did was, he did like a Manson thing, okay, but it was on his own daughter and a woman who I believe was a victim and returned back to him at one time, who was recruited or kidnapped sort of by his daughter, Jessie Ray. And then this other guy whose name I can't remember, but they inducted him into it. And he's the one who also strangled, I think it was actually his own ex-girlfriend that they kidnapped. And they made him strangle her, which was all on tape also. Whoo, man. Sick fucking shit. Sick fucking shite. Okay? For my Scottish friends. Sick fucking shite. Disgusting. There are a couple of interesting things about David Parker Ray I'd like to mention. One is that, like, from what I understand, he was raised by his grandparents, abandoned by his natural parents. Here we go again, the classic sort of abusive family, right? And then I heard that, like, his grandfather would beat him for any sort of aberration. And the grandfather, everywhere he was, he would bully David Parker Ray. That's what I understand. I'm going to do a tape on, I started to do a tape on bullying, and I screwed it up, and I intend to get back to it. It's a very important thing related to social problems. But, and I also heard that David Parker Ray this I read on a Reddit post, actually, that David Parker Ray was forced to have sex with, I believe it was his grandmother, while she instructed him to tie her up and then forced him to cause pain to her. Like, in other words, grandma is the masochist, but dominant over the grandson that she's inducting into being a sadistic, dominant individual. Okay, so that's another thing I heard. He was actually forced to tie up his grandma and hurt her while having sex with her. Pretty funky form of incest. Yeah, incense, up in smoke. I mean, that's really just one of the craziest kind of forms of incest I've ever heard. And I've heard a lot, so take it for what it's worth. One thing I want to mention at this point, as I mentioned in other tapes, is that actually one of the biggest common denominators that creates sexually deviant people, more than actually being sexually abused yourself, okay, is just exposure to chronic, long-term, ongoing violence. Even just exposure, not even being physically abused, but that sure helps, let's be honest. But that's one of the greatest variables in determining, it's one of the most commonly significant, reliable factors that you can pick out of anybody who becomes sexually or deviant or actually a murderer type as well, is that factor. So I just think that, that's interesting that here we got a guy who was exposed to sexual deviance, exposed to all kinds of crazy incestuous sex, and it's not surprising he turned out how he is, but I would also believe that he probably had some sort of genetic predisposition, which would be actually exemplified by the fact that if it's true that his grandmother made him do all this horrible shit, then there is kind of a genetic link in sexual deviance. It wasn't always on the environmental side, of the nature-nurture controversy. And then they inducted these two others. So it was a foursome at one point that were all just doing horribly, I'm going to use the word again, sadistic psychopathic behaviors on heavily drugged up girls. Matter of fact, I think one of the things that blew the whistle on them was a chick escaped.
Powering off.
And, oh, that's good. I'm sorry. I'm powering off? I don't hope not. But anyway, that was a little weird. One of the ways that I think the final victim got caught is she broke loose and she was in a drugged stupor and was running down the street and knocked on another trailer miles down the road, was naked, and somebody saved her. I think that was one of the main things. Okay, so that is basically the David Parker Ray sort of theme. One leader who did long-term, 3 days at a time, 4 days, a month, who knows, long time, okay? Murdered, mass murderer, producer of snuff films, and much worse than a Ted Bundy, I believe, because he prolonged the torture for so long, and also very analogous to Manson, because Manson inducted other people to do his dirty work in many ways, and in this case, I think it was like David Parker Ray inducted Mary pranksters to be with him. It's a horrible phrase to use, but he actually got them involved in it with him, to the degree that he ordered one of the people to murder his ex-girlfriend. Okay, it's a pretty funky story. All right, so now let me get Shawn Attwood for a minute and just talk about plea bargaining, okay? Because here's how this case ended. It ended, again, don't quote me about the facts, because I'm really not trying to give you a factual account of what happened. I'm just trying to paint a picture, okay? I'm trying to describe a process. I'm not trying to describe its content. You follow? So if you were to start to bring in the notion of plea bargaining, I mean, you all know how it works, I think, but I mean, at least according to Shawn, it's sort of like part of the machine that promotes filling private jails, so that, and also it lowers the cost of having to take people to trial. So if you can sign a plea bargain and get suckered into it, the state doesn't have to pay the money to try you. And you're led down a primrose path to believe you're getting a really great deal, when many people who were serving 8 years were marijuana consumers. This is according to Shawn Attwood. Please, I hope I'm quoting him right, but that's the whole notion of it. It's kind of a driven machine. And plea bargaining becomes one of the variables that helps relieve the financial stress on the state and also fill the private industry of private imprisonment. I don't know what the fuck you call it, but anyway, that's what I guess the scam is in terms of plea bargaining. So what ends up happening with this case is, boy, it's hard to explain, but all 4 people end up in the can, okay? But here's the catch. one of the most insidious people. Unfortunately, she's one of the worst victims too. But at some point in life, you have to take responsibility for like having been a victim, but also now being a perpetrator. Okay, you can't just live on your victimhood all the time. And so Jessie Ray takes a plea bargain to call state oh no, I think I have it wrong. I think what happens is David Parker Ray takes a plea bargain to take the whole load of everything if they alleviate his daughter, which they do. I think that's what happened. Okay. So she just did time served and walked. The other two also plea bargained. Okay. And they did, I think each one of them served this guy and the other woman that was a friend of Jesse's. I think they might have served at most 6 to 8 years for hideous murders. I mean, the guy strangled someone they were torturing. Okay. And the total irony of the whole story is fucking David Parker Ray has a heart attack the day he's locked up in jail and fucking dies. Oh my God. So all this energy that they put into pulling these various plea bargains, because the other two had plea bargains too, to support the evidence against him, right? So other than a confession, they wanted additional evidence. So at the end of this narrative, I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous, and it's ridiculous because of what the state did in this case. The jurisprudence system did is that they set something up where the guy they really wanted to get died the day he was put in jail. The worst co-conspirator, which is Jessie, the daughter, walks for time served. Okay. And the two others, because of their plea bargains and trying to just have additional ammo to back up David Parker Ray's confession, were these other two who I think at most served 8 years. And they're all walking free and have been for a long fucking time. What can I say? That's pretty crazy. If you look at Shawn Attwood's narrative, it's very similar. He's told his narrative many times. I'm not going to repeat it, but it's very similar. Plea bargaining. And, my dad was a criminal lawyer, right? And, it's very funny because my father was a litigator, okay? He wasn't just like a regular criminal lawyer. And so he would get his referrals mostly from other lawyers who were well-known criminal lawyers but didn't like to go to court. So my dad was like the Perry Mason who would just step in, or the guy who stepped in for OJ, although he wasn't like that famous or anything. But that was his job. He was in court most every day, just trying cases. I saw him as a kid one time. He was banging his hand on shit and stuff. I mean, it was like the Defenders. If anybody's old enough to remember that TV show, somebody will make a comment in the comment section below for that one, I bet. But fond memory. But anyhow, and another thing that David Parker Ray did, which I'm just going to try to throw out. It gets off of plea bargaining, but I'll save that for the grand finale. Another thing that David Parker Ray did was he tried to hide behind being a member of the SMBD community. And that's an interesting thing to explore because I've heard a lot of people like Sonia Polton and stuff and a couple other people say all kinds of people rationalize what they do under these labels, like I'm part of the SMBD community or I'm part of the Illuminati, when really they're just fucking crazy murderers and they just find some way to make it play it off. I don't know. It's interesting, but I wanted to mention that about him, that he played that off, I'm part of the SMBD community. And he got off because it was always about consensuality, you see. And he got off several times before, this whole thing happened. But again, in summary, here is a guy who we seem to know, murdered at least 30 people. There were 100 videotapes found on his premises when he got busted of him. I don't know if they were all murders, but they were like torturous, horrible, hideous things that were going on for days. Okay? The victims were drugged. He got, 3 other co-conspirators. I don't even know what they're co-murderers. That's a better word for it. Fancy language. Co-fucking murderers. Okay? To, get into it with him. And the whole notion of plea bargaining, and if I have it right, this is what it was that the way the plea bargains worked was that David Parker Ray took a plea bargain to take the whole weight of the whole thing if they released his daughter, which they did. And then the other two did plea bargains. These were murderers. I think the guy who served the longest term was only like 6 to 8 years. He is on tape strangling his ex-girlfriend at David Parker Ray's command. Come on, this dude's worse than Manson. I mean, there's levels. How can you compare levels of, total moronic insanity? It gets a little out there, but in my eyes, the guy is very sick. As were his co-murderers, just like the same way I would hold all the Manson girls or Tex Watson accountable. They were at least kind of adults. I don't know, but these people were all adults. So it doesn't matter how much they were victimized before they met David Parker Ray, because they're adults. They have to, at some point, you got to draw a line on when you're responsible for yourself and when you're not, So, that's my spiel. I don't think plea bargains are so great. I don't think they work in the service of the client. I think they work in the service of the state in terms of, reducing the costs of a trial, which costs them money. And also, I think it works in the service of the industrial commercial prison system because it fills beds and it overcrowds them. If you've ever heard any of Shawn Attwood's, tales, of which he tells many, he talks about the overcrowding. It's absolutely insanity. So, I hope that this just gives you a little different angle of how to look at this thing. Keep in mind, okay, David Parker Ray dies, I think the first day he's in fucking jail. His daughter walks because of a plea arrangement. And the two co-murderers serve sentences of like 6, 8 years, something like that. And they're all walking free. And one returned to Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Hell of a story, huh? Hope you enjoyed yourself. Thank you very much. And I will do the straight sign off. So thank you once again for attending. I can see I'm going to fuck this up. I thought I did a pretty good tape, and now I'm going to fuck up the ending. God damn it. Okay, let's try it again. Wait. Well, thank you once again for another heretical episode of Inside the World of Max Headroom. Okay. Bye.